Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. First, I want to thank Claremont and the Islamic Society of Orange County for holding this forum, and all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I also want to thank all the speakers that we just heard from. I know that I learned so much and hope to really, if anything, summarize and reinforce a lot of what we just heard. I want to talk to you today as we think about not only this election, but long term. How do we engage? How do we connect and integrate and influence our society? I want to talk to you about three broad themes: courage, compassion, and connectedness. And I think it has to begin with courage, because as so many other speakers have pointed out, there is a lot to look around and feel fearful of. We're not paranoid when we feel that there is very dangerous rhetoric about our community. This rhetoric isn't just something that is spewed from the television and stops there. People are internalizing that, they're being emboldened by it, and some people, they're going as far as committing acts of violence. I recently read a statistic that found that the Employee Equal Employment Commission, it's a federal commission that investigates employment discrimination. And I read that the percentage of religious-based employment discrimination cases that they investigated last year involving Muslims was 40%. 40% of their religious-based employee discrimination cases were of the Muslim community, a community that makes up 1% of the total population. So it's not paranoia to think that there is a problem. I'll also tell you that in our own research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, Muslims are the most likely faith community to report experiencing some level of discrimination in the previous year, where 18% say it's regular discrimination, and the majority say that they have experienced some level of discrimination in the year before. It far exceeds Jewish Americans, which are usually thought of as the most likely to experience religious-based discrimination, and of course far exceeds discrimination experienced by Catholics or Protestants. We also know that the FBI, according to the FBI statistics, and these are the most up-to-date statistics we have, that in 2014, there was a decline in hate crimes against every group in America except one, where there was a sizable increase. And that one group where there was an increase instead of a decline were against Muslims. Why I set this out is because I am under no delusion that things are okay. I am under no fantasy that everything is great. But it's precisely because of all of these things that I ask us to start this engagement from a place of courage. From a place of courage, not because there's nothing to fear, but because there are so many things that are more important than our fear. I'm reminded of a story that I want to draw you back to in the Quran. And it's actually the story of David and Goliath, Dawood and Galut, where they were marching to face this giant. And they were instructed in this march to face something that was very intimidating to them, that was something they were very afraid of. They were instructed not to drink from a specific watering hole. And some of the soldiers obeyed and didn't drink, and some of them didn't obey and essentially gave in to their impulse. and drank from that watering hole. And it's very interesting how these two groups then responded to the fear that they were experiencing. The group that gave into that impulse said, how will we ever fight this great giant? How will we, a small group, stand up to something so great, so powerful, so mighty? And the other group that restrained themselves, that obeyed, their response was very different because they weren't looking at their own ability. Their focus point wasn't their capacity. It was Allah. And their response was, many times have a small group defeated a large group. And I think that drawing on this story, we take a very important lesson. There's so many lessons from this story. The one I really want to emphasize is courage comes from a place of not focusing on yourself. I'm not asking you just to be confident, because there's a lot of great reasons to be scared. I'm asking you not to look just inward, but to look up. And I'm asking you to draw that strength from a restraint, from a place of restraining ourselves, obeying God first. Because I never feel strong when I think it's about me. I never feel strong when I think it's up to me or my abilities to do something. I have been in so many situations where I know I'm the least experienced, I'm the least knowledgeable, I'm probably the youngest in the room, and I'm definitely the only hijabi, usually the only Muslim, sometimes even the only woman, in very powerful rooms where everybody has better connections, more money, and more influence. And I have to sit there and I have to speak my truth, or at least be in the room so that everyone else is feeling uncomfortable when the racism starts. And don't ever underestimate the power of being in the room just to make people uncomfortable. That's our job sometimes. Just make it uncomfortable for people to be bigoted. And many, many times that's almost my only function in these rooms. But when I start to think about my comparative advantage versus everyone else in the room, when I drink from that watering hole of a material-based paradigm, I am very fearful. And I look around and I think, how can I stand up to all of this? I'm going to be quiet today. I'm going to be silent today. I can rationalize it, strategic today by being silent, right? Because if I speak, I might not be invited back, and that would be bad for the Muslim community. And I know the difference when I drink from that watering hole of giving in to the perception that it's about these material realities that will decide things. But on the days when I come into that room with the right paradigm, knowing that it's not up to me and that I am almost inconsequential to the entire process, that if anything, Allah will work through me if I am blessed and I am privileged to be a vehicle, I feel very strong. I almost feel indefensible, invincible. And I can say things that I don't even know where they came from. I was once interviewed on Meet the Press, and Chuck Todd asked me, what would you advise Trump to read to learn about Islam? And it was actually a very tricky question because I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I should say, well, he should read my book, or he should read the Quran. And then I realized this is not about learning about Islam, and you're trying, in this moment, actually you're trying to otherize us. This is not about Islam. And I said, it came out, I don't want him to learn about Islam, I want him to learn about the Constitution. And that response came from a place of knowing that what I am capable of and what we are all materially capable of is almost inconsequential, because we are never called to produce an outcome. We are only called to obey. So courage comes from that knowledge, from that internalizing that reality. We are called to obey, not to produce outcomes, and to divorce ourselves of that outcome. And it can make you see through things. Because I saw through that question. And some people actually criticized my answer. Maybe it wasn't perfect. Oh, you should have said you should read the Quran. Really? This is the thing? We want Trump. Here's the issue. I am not going to hold our community hostage to every presidential candidate being an Islamic scholar. He doesn't know anything about Hindus, right? But he's very positive towards them. The point is, we need to hold this country accountable to its own values. And what we need as a community is to be seen as equal citizens, not a special group that needs special treatment. But courage, it's also about understanding justice. And I'll tell you, this is something I discovered. I'm ashamed to say I only really heard this part of this ayah very recently. And we've heard this ayah so many times, stand for justice. I'm paraphrasing, even if it's against yourself and your family, or rich or poor. But the next part of the ayah is almost forgotten. We almost stop there. The next part of the ayah says, if you swerve away from justice, okay, we got that, or refuse, or turn away, and then the warning. This ayah is not just about behaving in a biased manner, which we all hear and of course recognize, and it's very important. It is also about refusing to act. Do you know how scary this is? When this ayah is a warning, that powerful warning is not just about swerving away from justice. It's about seeing injustice and doing nothing. Standing on the sidelines. And I want to talk to you about voting. This is, yes, it's a simple thing. It's something, I can make arguments for why it's not enough and perhaps it doesn't change as much as we want. But I'm just going to ask you one thing. If voting were so inconsequential and so unimportant, why do so many people work so hard to suppress the votes of people of color? Why are there so many people trying to intimidate people from actually going to vote? If it is so unimportant, why are there laws being passed in the guise of voter ID all over the country that are openly meant at suppressing the votes of certain people who will vote in a way that these groups don't want? If it isn't important, then why is it being fought? Why was it so suppressed for so many years in more institutional, less hidden ways, if it doesn't matter? So many people have struggled to give you and I this right, and we can't afford to turn away from it. But it's also about compassion. And I think courage is so important as a starting point, but it has to be tempered with compassion. I want to go back to something Dr. Bayan mentioned. And I'll say it in a different way, but it's really the same idea. We are such a battered community, really verbally assaulted every single day. Just by turning on the TV, we hear this. And so as essentially a beaten down, bullied community, it's natural and understandable why we would want acceptance. It doesn't mean we're bad people because we want acceptance. But I am going to ask us and challenge all of us to sidestep that impulse of wanting acceptance, to do something very different. To approach people not from a place of need for acceptance, but from a place of generosity, to offer compassionate understanding. Meaning this, when we stand and engage with other human beings, if we approach them from a place of need, which is the place of wanting acceptance, it's a very different power dynamic than when we approach people with something to offer them. And at the bare minimum, what we have to offer them is the gift of understanding. The gift of understanding us as people, our faith, who we are. If our goal, and I heard this once and it really has shaped everything I try to do. I was once told, make your goal not to be liked, but to be understood. To be accurately understood. And when people accurately understand you, you've given them a gift. And if by accurately understanding you, they hate you even more, you're still successful. You've still met your goal. Because there are people, the vast majority are not this way, but there are people, by understanding who you truly are, will hate you even more. And that is okay. We will not compromise who we are for these folks. And this really brings me to the problem of feeling like the bullied, battered child on the playground. Is psychologically that abused child feels like their well-being is in the hands of their abuser. And so they are almost obsessively concerned with winning that abusive parent over, getting their love as impossible as it is to get. And I really see some of these tendencies in our community. We are so focused on winning over hardened bigots. We have conferences about it. We spend entire days talking about our strategy for winning over these people. And in the process, we completely ignore the many, many more people who are actually holding out their hand in solidarity. We really are. Something really got me thinking. I was at a conference last week, and I spoke to about 450 people at the Diversity Leadership Council annual conference in Johns Hopkins University. And the president of the Diversity Leadership Council came up to me afterwards and said this. He said, look, everything you've said resonates, makes sense, and I want to support the Muslim community in this time. This is a gentleman, he was an African American who had spent really his whole life fighting for inclusion and diversity. And he said this to me. He said, now, if I want to show solidarity and support for the LGBTQ community, I would wear a rainbow pin or have a rainbow flag, and that would be a show of solidarity or support. What would I do? What symbol would I use to show support for Muslims? And I had no idea what to say, because we've never thought about it. We've never thought about giving people a concrete but simple way to visually show their support for us, to make it a movement. We have not created infrastructure for building these coalitions. And so another example, I had someone actually ask me, how do I donate to a Muslim organization that is sort of the equivalent of the ACLU? And there is an answer for that. So that was not hard for me. But the point is, we are spending most of our time on those that we will likely never win over, while ignoring the many, many more who are our natural allies in this fight for justice. But in approaching people from a place of compassion, We can't do it when our communities are not imbued with this compassion in a way that our Prophet described, in the way that the Prophet ﷺ was described by Allah in the Quran as a rahmah to all the worlds. If he is our example, and that was his signature trait, and we will make this our signature trait, we have to start internally. We have to start inside our families. We have to start inside our communities. We've all heard and talked and experienced microaggression. Microaggression is something I don't think we understand. It is debilitating. It destroys people, it destroys families, it destroys communities. But there's the opposite of microaggression. I'm going to offer this idea of micro-compassion. Micro-compassion is an idea that is central to the Sunnah. When other people sometimes are learning about the Sunnah, one thing that I've heard, remarked on so many times is the detail by which the Prophet ﷺ instructs Muslims in the way they interact with each other. Things that seem so minor, and yet there are teachings around them. Not to take someone's chair if they get up temporarily. Not to whisper between two people if there's a third one in the room. The etiquette of human connection is central to our community, and it is these things that build compassionate communities. It is these things that create a light within our own communities that can radiate out. But so often our communities inside them, they lack strength because they are fragmented. And they are fragmented because we are not engaging our families and each other with gestures of micro-compassion. Unfortunately, so many times I'm hearing that people experience more kindness outside the mosque than inside the mosque. That the mosque is a place where people are guarded. They're afraid of what someone will say. And this has to change if we are going to engage with this light of compassion. Our light of compassion has to extend far beyond the walls of the masjid, far beyond the walls. I won't even call them walls, they should be the bridges of our community. And I want to just give you one example, I hope as an inspiration. ISPU is doing a major research project in Michigan to look at American Muslim contributions in the state of Michigan as a case study. So one of the things we discovered as we were doing this research is the role of Muslim Americans in the Flint water crisis recovery. And we were simply blown away just by doing the research, just by documenting what Muslims were doing. Muslims have donated more water bottles than any other group or community in Flint. More than 1 million clean water bottles were donated by Muslims, and that's just the simplest thing I can give you. Muslims have volunteered to set up free medical clinics in Flint to care for people because of the contamination. Not only are they coming in and volunteering temporarily, but they're setting up social service organizations permanently in Michigan that are Muslim-founded and Islam-inspired. The woman who is leading the class action suit on behalf of the people of Flint is a Muslim woman. And this is one example in one city. And I share this with you because I agree with what Bree said about rewriting the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. We are not a benign tumor, we are a vital organ in the body of America. The more we think of ourselves in these terms, the more we will behave in this way. Now, in light of these concepts, we can't go from courage and compassion without talking about connectedness and our inherent connection to other human beings and the struggle of other human beings. The first thing that I hope that has become more and more obvious is that racism and bigotry doesn't discriminate. That the fruit of anti-Muslim bigotry and the fruit of anti-Black racism, state violence against Muslims and state violence against Black people are different fruits on the same tree of racism, of institutional racism. If we don't challenge the tree and only look at one fruit, we will never get past this problem. We have to understand the interconnection between these problems, between these challenges. And this is not just rhetoric. ISPU uncovered a very interesting overlap. We looked at legislation proposed at the state level that targeted American Muslims in the form of anti-Sharia legislation. What anti-Sharia legislation is, for anyone who isn't familiar, it's a law at the state level that basically says that that Sharia or foreign laws will not be valid, laws in that state. It's meant as not a solution in search of a problem that doesn't exist, but rather a way to fan fear of Islam and Muslims in that state by actually proposing a law against the takeover of Sharia in that state. Not because it's a real threat, but because it's a great way to flare up the sentiment of Islamophobia. However, in the process, when these ridiculous laws actually happen to pass, alhamdulillah, they haven't passed in most cases, but there are states where they have passed, like in Oklahoma, it directly curtails the rights of Muslim Americans. Suddenly, their wills are no longer valid in court. Their marriage certificates are no longer valid. Their divorce decrees are no longer valid because they are in some way based on Islamic principles. Whereas any other faith group is totally able to bring their own documents based on their faith principles, and the court will recognize them. So they are being challenged on constitutional grounds. But here's the thing about anti-Sharia legislation. We found that legislators who are proposing these legislations that are targeting Muslims, that 80% of these lawmakers are also proposing other laws that restrict the rights of other minorities. So when I say there's an overlap, there is a connection, that all of this is one tree of racism with different manifestations, I'm not just making a rhetorical point. I'm making an empirical point. These laws, now the two, very interestingly, we looked at a lot of different issue areas. The two places where there is the strongest overlap between anti-Muslim restrictive laws and other laws are anti-labor laws and voter suppression laws. That's where there's the biggest overlap. Those who are going after Muslims are also going after the vote and suppressing the votes of African Americans and Latinos in this country, as well as the ability of workers to organize. So recognizing our interconnectedness. I also wanted to add one thing that I think is really important. Anti-Muslim sentiment is not a problem for just Muslims. And that was really part of my response to that question about what would you teach Trump about Islam. This is not about the 1%. This is not about Islam. This is about American democracy and the fact that it's under threat. The strongest predictor, and this is, even stronger than whether or not you know a Muslim, believe it or not, the strongest predictor of anti-Muslim sentiment is anti-Jewish sentiment. if you admit to being anti-Semitic, you are 32 times as likely to also have anti-Muslim prejudice. And being anti-Semitic is the strongest predictor of Islamophobia, stronger than anything else. So this threat we're calling Islamophobia doesn't just focus on Muslims. But it's not just about minorities either. When we are fed fear day in and day out, it impacts how we look at the world. Every single American is threatened by this regular diet of fear that we are getting. Fear on a neurological level makes us more accepting of authoritarianism, conformity, and prejudice. Fear erodes the foundation of our democracy. Fear kills freedom. So we are not here simply to defend ourselves, simply to fight for the rights of the 1%. By resisting this threat, this cancer to our country, we are fighting for the rights of every American to be free, of every American to not be manipulated by the media or by their politicians. For every American to be safe, to have actors of the state actually do their job to protect, not to criminalize a race or a religion. So in closing, I want to encourage every single one of you to take advantage of the rights that we have, the rights that have been fought for by so many before us, and vote this election, and then stay involved for the long term. Thank you.